Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Bom dia a todas y a todos. Good morning to everyone and welcome to our last of the series of events that we have dedicated to the Task Force on Net Zero Policy COP30 report. For those of you who do not know the task force, very quickly, just going to introduce it to you. At COP26, the Secretary General established a high-level expert group to examine actually the practices of non-state actors when it comes to their pledges and their transition plans. And basically what he asked us, a group of us, is please, set up like a benchmark, a series of criteria against which, we can benchmark their pledges and their transition plans, because the credibility has been put into question and there's been a lot of greenwashing in that area. We presented the report and the last of the recommendations was actually very simple. It just said we do need policy. We need policy to really accelerate, the take of credible transition plans, mainly for large companies and financial institutions. And the Task Force on Net Zero Policy was created the following COP, as a spin-off of the HLEC. And what we do is very simple. We do research analysis on policies aimed at supporting credible transition pathways by large companies and financial institutions across the G20 and beyond. And then we have created like a space for policy sharing, learning, so different jurisdictions can share their learnings, their experiences, and learn and work together towards that one day, really global policy framework. Now, I have on my left-hand side, I have Mathilde Messner from the OECD, who sits on our board, and I'm very pleased to have you. Thank you so much for all the work you've done and your support. And what we're going to do today, which is the last of the series, is we're going to have a conversation on some of the key findings and policies identified in the report with actual policymakers. And let me tell you, we have an incredible lineup. So I'm going to introduce you, our panelists, and then we'll start with the debate. So Mathilde Messner, Deputy Director of DG Environment OECD, thank you for coming. Wu Yiran, Director, National Climate Change Secretariat from Singapore, thank you very much for coming. Isabela Damaso Maya, Head of Sustainability International Portfolio Investors Unit, Central Bank of Brazil, thank you for coming again, and very nice to see you again. And Diana Aconcia, who's just joining us, Director, International Affairs and Climate Finance, DG Clima, European Commission. Very nice to see you, Diana, and welcome. And we'll have a discussion among ourselves, and then at 10:30, we will welcome U.S. Senator for Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse, with whom I will have a little fireside chat. So let's start macro, as I said. So Mathilde, the OECD has been doing research and analysis on policies in this area for, I don't know for how long, yeah? Could you give us a picture of, the last 10 years? So since the Paris Agreement, where are we? What has been the evolution, and what policies do you think have been most successful?
Okay, so it's in broad terms, in the last 10 years, we have progressed a lot in terms of disclosure, transparency, taxonomies, so that was kind of the rule of the game, with the EU playing a leading role in this space, but I will let you maybe brag about this more. And it was, yes, kind of an movement of acceleration. Where we are now is a more tricky moment, because it's in the last 2 or 3 years, you have been at the same time a moment of deepening, where all there has been an awakening to the fact that, okay, disclosure is good, we are all for disclosure, transparency is good, but maybe it's not enough. So we need somehow to fine-tune and to strengthen all these things. Fine-tune in a sense, for example, looking at the CapEx disclosure, how it's important, and I guess we'll go back to that. strengthening in terms of we need to make much more mandatory all these disclosures, etc. And also strengthening in a sense of strengthening the credibility, the integrity of all what is disclosed. So we are in a moment, kind of a second step of strengthening, deepening, fine-tuning of all these policies. But at the same time, there is the latest trend coming from the US, where we are facing a backlash. Let's put it this way. We are facing a serious backlash. We are even facing it at the EU level. So there is some kind of, you mentioned recalibration at the EU level. We had a few days ago a real backlash at the EU. So we are really in a messy moment, I would say, in terms of policies regarding transition plans, etc. But the good news is that there are still movement in more the south and the east, and that's the report. The task force report makes this very clear. Like countries in the south and countries in the east and in Asia are still moving forward forcefully. So they might be the next champions, of this train. Well,
absolutely, and the report not only becomes very clear that the center of gravity is shifting towards the global south and east, but actually 3/4 of all the new policies, developed and adopted last year have been outside of North America and Europe. So we've seen a real momentum in the global south, and very particularly in Asia Pacific, but also Brazil, in Latin America, in South Africa, Australia, and elsewhere. So, Diana, last legislature in the EU, it was incredible momentum in Europe, right? With the Green Deal, the twin transition, and a whole set, I would say it was such a comprehensive, right, and detailed policy package. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of an assessment of that package, of what has worked the best, which policies you think have been the champions, maybe what has not worked so well and might need, a revision or a strengthening. So yes, please, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for joining late. I hope that I had managed to warn you.
I know, we excuse her.
Yeah. So the I think I think it's clear. Everybody in the field is looking at what is happening. What, as Mathilde said, what has happened in the European Parliament the other day, and so understands that this is a sort of a moment of truth for some of the European policy, particularly for those pertaining to the sustainable finance package. It's really to say what in this field has been most successful is not so easy, because we have seen that there is a demand, because in spite of the backlash, companies are using, for example, the EU taxonomy, the green bond standards, and they have brought a lot of transparency in identifying the sustainable investments. And the demand from the companies is still there. The idea of the Commission is to maintain the direction of travel while reducing the burden. We thought that our proposals was balanced. Now, with the vote of the Parliament, I'm not sure anymore. Let's see what happens in the discussion between Parliament and the Council. But I think we don't have to get discouraged, and we have to focus on the policies that are more effective to drive capitals. And among the successes, I would like to mention something which is not normally qualified as sustainable finance, but it is the cornerstone of our climate policy, which is the ETS, the carbon pricing. Because we've been strengthening the ETS now for many years. We've had it for 20 years, and at the beginning it wasn't really biting. But with the successive reforms, we saw that it became a really impactful instrument to reorient the capitals towards the transition. It addresses the fundamental market distortion, which is that the externality of emitting carbon. It moves a really impressive amount of resources from the polluting to the non-polluting sectors, and it really what we think that has given the strongest market signal. Just to give an idea of the power of the ETS, since its inception in 2005, emissions in the sectors covered have fallen by 50%. The covered sector are power, the heavy industry like steel and cement, domestic aviation, and since the beginning of this year also shipping in the European Union and also shipping towards and from the European Union. And it has raised 250 billion of revenues since 2013, in the last 12 years. And most of the EU ETS revenues go back to the EU, and the member states are requested to invest them on climate action. And what doesn't go back to the member states serves to finance two climate action funds, the Innovation Fund and the Modernization Fund. And the Innovation Fund is a fund that finances companies that are beyond the research but not yet at the marketing stage. And that has been an incredible success. All the calls and the auctions that we finance, they attract an incredible number of companies. They're always oversubscribed. We never have enough. So this means that there is the demand. So we talk about the backlash, but in the real world, we are seeing that the demand is still there. And I think that what we have to do is to continue to combine policies that are moving the private capital, so the sustainable finance frameworks, with the policies that are moving the public capital. And this is what we are trying to do with our Clean Industrial Deal that we launched last February. And perhaps I can say a little bit more of that later.
Thank you, Diana. You're absolutely right about the success of the EU ETS. In fact, it's very interesting because when I hear about criticisms of the taxonomy, I recall at the very beginning, everyone was complaining about the EU ETS and saying it's too complicated, blah, blah, it's not working, blah, blah. And then it was actually reviewed, and it works, as you said. It has really delivered emission reduction. So really good to hear about the power of carbon pricing. Now, Isabella, from the Brazilian Central Bank, right, what we've seen across the world is central banks actually being very active in this area, and it's very, very particularly looking at the physical risk and transition risk, how they might affect financial stability. So could you tell us a little bit more about the thinking in the bank, and what sort of policies, you're thinking of maybe putting into place, what are the thoughts and the debate in the bank?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, for sure. Here in Brazil, the climate consequences, the climate change consequence has been notable. So there is not anymore a matter of discussion, right? And recently, in 2000, just to go over some examples on the recent years, in 2021, 2022, we had a major drought, the worst one for the last 90 years. And the level of rainfalls was 25% below the average for the past 4 decades. And this was a dramatic impact on the agricultural sector, which is a quite important sector, economic sector for Brazil. But also, due to the lower water levels, most of our energy supply comes from hydroelectric power plants, right? So we had to turn on thermoelectric power plants, which are much more expensive. So all of this together had an impact on the inflation of around 0.67 basis points over the target inflations that we have. Also, in 2023, we have the the worst drought also in the Amazon region. It was the worst in 120 years. So it had a huge impact on transportation of people and goods, and with impact in our external trade. And more recent, last year, we had a dramatic flood in the south region of the country, in the Rio Grande do Sul, where it demanded the central bank also to come in and set some measures in order to guarantee financial stability of the banks that are more active in the region. So it shows that not only on monetary policy, but on financial stability, the huge impact of climate change in the central bank's usual mandates, right? And in this regard, this is not a new topic for the Central Bank of Brazil. Our old regulation on environmental issues goes back to 2008. Since 2014, we have demanded the financial sector, the financial institutions, to have a social environmental responsibility policy. In 2017, we have already introduced social environmental risk into the risk management framework. So as you can see, as the first ones were even before the Paris Agreement, before the creation of NGFS, which is the network for greening the financial system, a voluntary group of central banks that work together in order to speed up this best practice on climate issues at the financial sector. And we have a very broad agenda that covers regulation, trying to bring more transparency, standardization when disclosing data, also on improving risk management from the financial institutions, so they can include that social, climate, and environmental issues in the risk management approach, as well as other initiatives related to data, related to investment of international reserves, and on our own operations, because we also want to lead by example, implementing this kind of actions in our own operations. So it's a very broad aspect.
Yes. Very, very interesting, not only monetary policy, but equally for financial stability. The central banks are stepping in. And just to let you know, the NGFS also sits on our board. Iran, Singapore has been and is one of the sustainable finance hub, right? It has been leading in the region in this area. Could you give us an overview, a picture of, what are the policies around sustainable and regulations around sustainable finance?
Thank you very much, Helena, and thank you for having me. Actually, I think a lot of our financial regulations when it comes to green finance and climate is very similar to what Brazil has just shared. And so I don't think I will repeat it. But in short, there are a few key objectives. The first is really, I think, resilience, right? And I think the reason why the central bank has always been so involved is because financial and economic resilience is at the heart of all government, I think, objectives. So when that is more of a defensive role, looking at risks, making sure our big financial institutions do stress testing on, their portfolios for both transition risks. So what happens when decarbonization, when companies need to decarbonize, but also climate risks. And I think in particular in Singapore and Southeast Asia, it is a region that is particularly prone to climate risks. So I think that's the first part. The second part really is that opportunity, right, that growth. Because we like to say that, and I think everyone recognizes that with every change, with every risk comes a lot of growth opportunities as well. So on that, I think that is another area where we have gone quite ahead of the curve. I think we recognize that as a regional financial hub, there's a lot that we can be a first mover in. So there's such a range of policies, I think, on things like, taxonomy, I think we have done quite a fair bit with ASEAN as well as EU and China. I think we can talk more about that later. But also that our central bank has gone ahead to develop certain specific financial instruments that I think is particularly relevant for our region. So I think the first I would say is blended finance. So that is really about using concessional capital to draw in private capital, and together at a portfolio level, you use it to invest in projects, climate projects that otherwise would never have gone ahead. And that's really, so Singapore ourselves, we have gone ahead to commit up to, I think, 500 million USD. This is grant money. We don't expect to get a single cent back. But what we don't want is to put that money all into one or a few projects, because individually projects are risky. What we want to do is to draw in capital. Our target, I think is 1:10. So we did that recently for FastP, one of the closures. And as a portfolio, then it goes around to Asia as well as the rest of the world if we see good projects to invest. So this was something championed by our central bank. And I think they are extremely innovative in thinking about such solutions. Maybe the second I will just quickly touch on is Traction. So Traction, we just released a report. I highly encourage everyone to look at it. It's basically how do we use financing to encourage early coal retirement? And it gets a bit sensitive, I think, especially in the context of Europe. But I think in Asia, when we look around us, Singapore has almost no coal, but our neighbors have a lot of coal, and many of them are very young. And I think you could say, we don't like coal, and I'm going to ignore it. Or you could meet them where they are and say, this is a big problem. How can we help you to solve that problem, as well as for the rest of the world? So Traction is basically using transition credits to retire coal early while replacing that capacity with renewable energy. Yeah. So I would say generally, and the third limb really is capability development for our financial market, because you need that to do the whole range of work I just talked about.
Thank you so much. Really interesting, those coal retirement, financial instruments. Diana, could you give us a little bit of the picture of the sustainable finance package in the EU? What is your assessment in terms of, again, what elements have really worked? Where do you see the package moving forward?
Thank you. These are really uncertain times on how the package is moving forward. At the moment, we are looking at the review of taxonomy and at the review of the SFRD, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. So these are both very important, because what we're trying to do here is increase the usability of these regulations. The taxonomy has worked. The companies have used it, and actually we have seen that the companies that are investing under taxonomy have on average a better performance than others. So it works. On the other hand, we know that there are difficulties, and when you embark in such a complex architecture, you need to learn by doing. For example, we realize now that some of our requirements under the disclosure regulations and others are making it more difficult for some of European companies to invest in emerging economies, because they cannot report, since they don't have the same regulation as the EU, they cannot report, and therefore they will not make their own targets of green targets if they invest abroad. And these are problems that need to be resolved. And partly they can be resolved, and they will be resolved by the fact that, as you said before, companies in the rest of the world are forging ahead. In this moment, faster than the EU, which is normal, because the EU was the front runner, and now the others are catching up. And I am delighted that China has made progress, that Brazil has made progress, and I know that Brazil is very, very keen to cooperate with the European Union and to ensure that the taxonomies are interoperable, because this is the way to go to make sure that investments and capitals can flow smoothly where they are more needed. Another point I wanted to pick up, you were talking about the coal transition. Yes, that is a discussion that we are having with several partners, because the definition of what is transition finance is something where we do not necessarily agree with others. I've had a lot of discussions, for example, with Japan, and we have agreed that At some point we disagree, but that we have marked it as an area of cooperation for next year, because we need to clarify it. At the same time, in our SFDR review discussion, we have introduced transition investments, and I think this is a big step ahead. The important thing is to define what transition is. So we are trying to anchor the the transition category to the existence of a transition plan which is aligned with Paris Agreement and with the European climate law that we do have, and it's also the anchor for the need for the transition plans according to our disclosure regulation. We don't, of course, the European climate law is European. In Singapore, you don't have the same. But I think this is a super important discussion, because I agree with you, we cannot make coal disappear, but we need to make sure that we put companies on a pathway where the final destination is clear and is net zero. Very, very open discussion. We are in a phase at the moment, a little bit of turmoil, where it's a bit difficult also to engage in cooperation with other countries, which is a pity, because I think we should do that. But I think also we need to have, at this moment, we need to stabilize our own package. But again, I am really glad that others are doing the same, because we need capital flows everywhere, not only in the European Union, and Asia is Asia, and then Brazil. I mean, these are where growth, economic growth, and the transition are going the fastest. So it's very much needed and welcome.
Thank you, Diana. You're absolutely right. Sometimes we focus on what has not worked, and we forget everything has really, really worked. Like, thanks to SFDR, even if there were aspects of provisions in SFDR that need to be reviewed, has created, or has increased ESG within the European markets up to 62%. Today's markets, European markets, are 62% ESG in terms of assets under management. Very interesting in Spain that we haven't yet transposed the ESRS for other reasons. We have the Spanish Financial Markets Authority. We have identified already 78% of the companies who were initially meant to report against ESRS that they have reported against ESRS. So I think there is a lot of, as you said, a lot of movement, of progress, some recalibration. Part of it is really needed, Sometimes, some of us, we think we might be going a little bit too much, too far, but things are really undergoing. And talking about that, and talking about disclosures, and as Diana was saying, the world is catching up. We identify in the report that 60% of the world's GDP has adopted or is in the process of adopting ISSB standards or compatible standards like the ESRS. So Isabella, Brazil has been the first adopter of the standards. Could you tell us the expectations in terms of the new reporting framework?
Yes, thank you. In fact, in 2024, the central bank has requested the financial institutions to start reporting according to on their financial statement, right? According to ISSB S1 and S2. And this will start next year for the biggest companies. We also have a classification of the financial institution conglomerates that is S1, S2, S3, so it's the same letter, so sometimes it makes some confusing. For the first one, the first major one, S1 and S2, they will start next year, but the others will start in 2028. But in fact, what we expect with that is that they will be incorporated into the governance, into strategies and risk management, this decision-making process, so we have availability of credible information in the financial statement to make it important on the decision-making process. So incorporating that and also having credible information which is assured by external auditors, right? So these are sometimes the types of change or adjustment that we expected to see. But I have to be honest that this is on the accounting basis, but on the predation side, we had already started that journey back in 2021 when Brazil, the Central Bank of Brazil, was one of the first central banks to request from the financial institutions to disclose on a mandatory basis according to the TCFD. So, and at that time, we understood that we had to do it gradually. So at that time, we demanded only mandatory information on what we call qualitative information, which is specifically governance, strategy, and risk management. But last week, we have just put on a public consultation improvements in this regulation, which are improving the qualitative information, but also introducing the quantitative information based on the tables that were discussed on the Basel Committee, and also aligned with ISSB S1 and S2. So it's on public consultation until February next year, and we expect to have the final regulation ready in the first semester of 2026. So with that, we will have a more complete approach on a standardized way of disclosing this information for the public.
This is bliss for investors' ears that are starting to hear how the rest of the world is moving forward towards mandatory reporting, so they will be able to use that reporting for their portfolios. Iran, what about Singapore? What is your disclosures framework, and particularly if you can also touch upon transition plans?
Yeah, thank you. So we were previously on TCFD, and we made the decision to move our climate reporting framework to ISSB. So actually, earlier this year, we delayed the transition to ISSB mandatory reporting because we were hearing very strong feedback from our companies that, I mean, if you've seen I'm sure we have all seen it, it is extremely long and very rigorous. A lot of our companies said that they simply, especially in today's economic climate, weren't able to do it. They didn't have the right capacity. So what we did was that we went out with a tiered framework. The very largest listed companies still have to go ahead with full reporting. However, for the next tier of what we call medium-sized listed companies, they have more time, and the small companies have even more time. Sorry. So I won't go through the details here, but I think the idea was really that we struggled quite a lot with that. Balancing between going ahead with transition versus being very acutely aware of how that will be received and whether companies are even ready to do that. And I think what we have made very clear is that although the requirements are postponed, the key is really that in the interim, we need to provide capacity building for companies so that you don't face the same issue a few years down the road when the requirements kick in again. So I would say generally the requirements are quite similar to what has been discussed, but really trying to take a more calibrated approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Disclosures, of course, are very important, yeah, but it is the quality of disclosures is, I would say, as important, right? And part of that is on what sort of transparency on the methodology used, or even going one step further, like the ESRS, and pinpointing to what methodology needs to be used, because that's really important to provide climate integrity data. Mathilde, could you tell us a little bit more about the what the report recommends in terms of climate data?
I think in terms of integrity, there are many things. I mean, first, if you stay at the disclosure and transparency level, you need to move from some broad commitments, to structured, comparable plans with clear targets, governance information, and implementation pathways. So the next step in terms of really the disclosure and transparency is to make sure that companies disclose also the assumptions, the scenarios that they use, the investment implications, that mean the capex, they disclose the capex that's becoming real, so that after the regulators or the investors, they can not only assess the ambition but also the feasibility and whether they are going really in the right direction. And in terms of really the governance, we have guidance at the OECD, OECD guidance on transition finance, and the idea is to there are two ideas there, that really all this needs to be really embedded in the company's risk management processes and the broader governance processes, and the progress needs to be disclosed to the boards, to the shareholders, and to the relevant public entities. So that the idea is that for these transition plans, that they become really like decision relevant, and not only like broad commitments on the way forward, but really how we will go forward and what is happening de facto in terms of companies' actions.
You're absolutely right. One of the things was very interesting about researching for this report was that we realized there were two, broadly speaking, approaches to transition plans and transition planning. There were those countries, let's say it more the global north approach, which is this is the disclosures that you need to provide to investors and other stakeholders in terms of those are the requirements. And then the EU went a step further and said you need, certain companies need to adopt, a plan, a transition plan, compatible with the Paris Agreement. But there were other countries that they didn't take the disclosure path. What they did is that within real economy policies, then they started to identify a few high-emitting sectors, and for those, either they provided a carbon budget, and then they said, okay, that's the carbon budget for the sector, this is the sector roadmap, you need to start setting targets against that roadmap, and then develop a transition plan, tell us what you're going to do to meet that. So, two very different approach, but the essence, right? The real essence is exactly the same, which is basically you need to set targets, that they are science-based, that they're verifiable, and then, develop the transition plan. And the other thing that we realized is that there's a lot of almost like reporting fatigue in some regions. So we need to start thinking about how we prioritize, right? So with that in mind, Mathilde, the OECD has done a lot of work on transition plans. You were part of the EU platform on sustainable finance that we also did a lot of work, together with DG Klima and other DGs within the European Commission on start extracting the key elements, right? What is really, really necessary, as you were saying, to get companies to act? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I mean, there is one real element, it's that this capex, capex disclosure, because that's the proof of the pudding somehow. You can have a fantastic transition plan with a lot of disclosure, etc. But if this does not translate in real investment, transition investment, that means that your transition plan is just a broad commitment and nothing more. So I think if you can go in the direction of requiring companies to disclose how much of their capital expenditure is really aligned with the taxonomy or with like whatever you want, but to showcase that this is really how they project themselves in the future. So that if there is one thing, I think it's this one.
You're absolutely right. What we realized, for example, with the taxonomy in Europe, the platform, when we were asked by the European Commission to assess the extent to which it has actually worked and to develop a methodology to see, to start monitoring capital flows, we saw that it is actually when it comes to guiding capital investments of companies that it's been most successful. We accounted more than 800 billion invested in climate mitigation by June, and that it was not only, as you would say, it was the capex, but it was also the capex plan attached to it, and how it relates to the transition plan, that it was really what it was really appreciated by investors, yeah? And you were talking about we need to know, and particularly investors, where, what percentage is aligned with 1.5, but also, the exposure exactly, right?
This this is more difficult. It's a more difficult proposition, and we really need to know how companies continue to invest in not aligned, activities, and then they lock themselves in for the long term in fossil fuel intense activities. So the capex give you this really real image of whether the companies are transitioning, and they give you where they're investing in transition and where they are not, and where they are locking themselves in non-transition aligned activities for very long, because these activities usually are big investment for long.
Absolutely. And I think that the indicator within ESRS of exposure, capex exposure to fossil fuels is as important as to go hand in hand with the capex alignment with taxonomy, because then you know whether or not they're investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is at this point really what we need to avoid, right? Moving in, because I'm conscious about time, there is one of the findings of our report last year was that resilience, nature, and just transition were not systematically being embedded in mitigation roles. So I was wondering if both Isabella and Diana, you could tell us a little bit more about the resilience, the resilience progress in terms of policy, Isabel, and then Diana, maybe think about, how we can really foster adaptation investments, because I was talking before about the taxonomy of the 800 billion, actually very little was going to adaptation. I think that we examined the data, we decided that it was actually bigger in terms of companies adapting. It's just, it's very difficult to split the actual investments, which part is adaptation versus which part is just maybe, for a new plant or whatever else, yeah? So we think it's a little bit bigger, but still is, we can say it's underinvested. Isabella.
Yes, for sure, Brazil. Is it working? Okay. Brazil has a vast size and diverse ecosystem, including the Amazon, Cerrados, savannas, a vast coastline. So that means that we are pretty much exposed or vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, right? So it's important. I mentioned many events that we have in recent years. So it's very important for us to improve integration of adaptation in our development framework. And at the same time, we know that it is still quite a challenge to attract investments, both nationally and internationally to that. So what we have been doing is, in fact, to trying to work in a more strategic way on that, and how can we find de-risking instruments or innovative instruments that can make this kind of investment more attractive for the country. And in this regard, I would like to mention a program that was released by the government called EcoInvest. I don't know how familiar we are with that. So the idea is to drive specific lines, credit lines for a tact mechanism that can make this kind of investment more attractive, like blended finance, like helping the construction of more attractive or investable projects for liquidity line, and also for FX, exchange rate hedge. So in the case of Brazil, historically, the exchange rate volatility has been a big difficulty for attracting foreign investment, long-term foreign investment in the country. So what we are doing is that we will, with this EcoInvest, to provide hedge instruments for this type of investment, and investments that include projects that are aligned with this transformation ecological plan that we have, that include bioeconomy, include transition energy and includes very adaptation project as well. So, and this is where central banks participates, because we are working together with the IDB. This EcoInvest has the support of UK and the IDB. So IDB being a multilateral organization with a AAA rating, they access this kind of hedge in the international markets with a lower cost. They transfer that to the Central Bank of Brazil, and the Central Bank will provide that kind of instruments for financial institutions here that will be crediting loans for this kind of projects. So this is by creating this innovative mechanism that will turn the investments in this kind of project more attractive for investment, trying to attract more investment for financing adaptation.
Thank you. Diana.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, and there are similarities between what the European Union is doing and Brazil. And yes, we have discussed both in the domestic and international context for the difficulty of investing in adaptation, and there are a lot of challenges that it would be too long to list now. But in the European Union, the idea that climate risks are something to be reckoned with, and that they are a key economic challenge, and you know, they're not the domain of the ecology or the nature, but we are talking about enormous damage to our economy if we don't become resilient. So this idea, I think, is starting to gain a lot of traction. Last year, the European Union had the first climate risk assessment at European level. We looked at 36 risks across the economy and the society, like finance and health and food security, and we realized that we were not adequately prepared for any of the risks. And this is sobering, because we are talking about the so-called global north, a rich country, and we are not prepared. And actually, our own geographical diversity enhances the risks, because the south of Europe, in the south of Europe, the risks are more critical than in the north of Europe. I mean, Elena, you and I are coming from the south of Europe, and we know very well what we're talking about. So we need to adapt both our regulatory framework and our financial framework to this. So by the end of 2026, the Commission will propose a new integrated framework for climate resilience, which will mainstream the concept of resilience by design in all the expenditure decisions that we have. So it will mean that all investments that are vulnerable and exposed to climate impacts must be designed to address the climate-related risks. And this concept now has also been introduced in the new European Union, what we call the multi-annual financial framework, basically the European Union budget from 2028 on. This for us is really a key achievement. And also the integrated framework, we will also look at the question of risk ownership, which is also quite tricky to resolve. But I also want to mention a couple more things. The European Central Bank is adjusting its risks policy, and so now when it gives loans to banks, it will take the exposure to climate risk into account. And this is enormously powerful from a regulatory point of view. But I think the regulatory framework alone is not sufficient, because you need to make finance flow. And as Isabella said, you need instruments like blended finance to make this happen, because climate adaptation is one of those sectors where the private finance needs some incentive. And for this, we have the big support of the European Investment Bank. They have recently published their climate roadmap number 2. The European Investment Bank is really extremely motivated on climate. They call themselves the Climate Bank. And that includes a target of investing 30 billion on adaptation between 2026 and 2030. And even for the European Investment Bank, it's not easy to find investment, both in the European Union, by the way, and outside of the European Union, which is where I collaborate more closely with them. And so we will closely cooperate between the climate policy people and the bank people to look for the investments that will need to be financed by the bank. So I think to find more finance for adaptation and resilience is really a whole of government and financial institution work where we all need to collaborate to create the bankable investment, I would say, and to create the right incentives in the way that we have created them for mitigation for the capitals to flow to the right places.
Thank you so much, Diana. Unfortunately, we need to end our discussion here. We had two more areas that we thought about talking about: carbon credits and particularly carbon removals, because now with the overshoot, knowing that the overshoot is going to be inevitable, more than ever we need to really develop carbon credits for removals, and at the same time wanted to talk about taxonomies, but I guess we'll have to leave that for the next COP or for the next COP. But thank you so much to our panelists for being today with us. Today is Saturday, it's early morning Saturday in Brazil, and we so much appreciated all the insights that you have shared with us. So please join me in thanking them.
Our western suburb.
Senator Whitehouse, it's such a pleasure to have you here. We know how demanded you are, so thank you for giving us some of your time. I was mentioning before you arrived that a few days ago we launched the Task Force Net Zero Policy Report for COP30. This report will be presented to the UN Secretary General, and basically what the report does is an analysis of the policy development over the last year and over the last decade. And what we realize is that despite the backlash in the US and recalibration in the EU, policy development supporting credible transition pathways has continued apace, and more importantly, we've seen like the center of gravity is moving to the global south and east, particularly Asia Pacific. So, Senator Whitehouse, have the US and Europe lost their leadership? And do you think that US states such as California, that has such an ambitious climate goals and policies, will be able effectively counterbalance the dismantling of climate and green rules in the US by the Trump administration?
On the question of US leadership, I would point out that what is happening in the US is not representative of the US population. What you're seeing, and it's a novel thing for the United States, what you're seeing is a government that has been corrupted by the fossil fuel industry. And the Trump administration is executing an agenda of the fossil fuel industry that was bought and paid for by the fossil fuel industry. That is a completely different thing from where the American people are. Where the American people are is very much behind climate action. If anything, I would say that even my Democratic Party, which has been far better than the Republicans on climate action has been behind the public on climate action. There's more activity, more excitement, more interest on behalf of the public than my party even has been showing. So you have to ignore Trump, even though he's the president, as a marker of where the U.S. is. And frankly, you can actually move the center of U.S. public opinion ahead of where the Democratic Party has been. On the EU, I don't know that I would concede that there's a lack of leadership in the EU. I think the most important thing on the planet right now in terms of solving the climate crisis is the EU CBAM. While it's free for the fossil fuel industry to pollute, we will lose the climate fight. And the biggest thing to end the free-to-pollute business model right now is the CBAM. So that is real leadership. The UK joining it will show even more leadership. Australia joining it will show even more leadership. I hope Canada, Mexico, this could really be the turning point towards actually reducing emissions and actually opening a pathway to climate safety.
Thank you. I was about to ask you about the CBAM, but you anticipated. Do you think that we can aspire one day to see a US ETS at federal level?
We have been working on the equivalent of a CBAM in the Senate. This is a rare area of bipartisanship. There is a Republican carbon tariff bill, and I have a Democrat carbon tariff bill, and all the senators who are working together on this, Republicans and Democrats, actually are working off a shared analytic platform of resources for the future, the Silverado Analytics Group, and to a certain degree the Bruegel Group in Europe, which is the analytics group supporting the CBAM. So there's a lot of good work that is being done. We're not there yet. But I will say one thing. The Trump administration trade people acknowledge very plainly that when one country or one company is cheating on environmental standards and getting an economic advantage as a result, that's proper for tariffs. The problem is that the Trump administration's principles are soluble in oil, and so it's not clear that those principles will ever be made manifest in support for a bill, but we have begun conversations with the Trump trade people about what a bipartisan carbon tariff bill that they could support would look like. I should say we can't call it a carbon tariff bill, we have to call it foreign pollution fees, but that's okay, the job is done the same way. So there's some significant action stirring.
This is really good news. The report not only does a deep dive on carbon credits and carbon markets policies we've been seeing really accelerating over the last year, but also in terms of methane reduction policies.
Yes.
We've identified policies trying to really tackle methane in 32 out of the 37 jurisdictions that we have analyzed. That includes the G20 and 17 more. So why do you think there's this surge in interest, and why is addressing methane so important, so critical?
I think the reason a lot of this is surging, let's focus particularly on methane leakage. There isn't a good argument for why methane leakage should happen. There isn't social value in leaking methane. There's actually some value in capturing methane and putting it into the pipes and selling it. So you don't have a big advocacy group saying, let's leak more methane, we're for methane leakage. And what you see in terms of both carbon dioxide and methane is a really dramatic market failure. It is super basic market economics that the price of the harm of your product, specifically the pollution your product causes, needs to be baked into the price of the product. You go back to the conservative economist Milton Friedman, that was a core principle. So the Republicans who like to ignore climate change because of their fossil fuel funding nevertheless have to admit that polluting for free is a bad economic model. So that gives everybody a place to start. It's also easy to spot, particularly methane. So the new satellites that are going up there that show where bad methane leaks are happening make a new regime of accountability that doesn't require the political process to execute on, right? Once you know that that company is leaking that much methane in that place, you can go and do something about it yourself. You can protest outside. You can send letters to the corporate shareholders. You can go onto the internet and call it out. You can take all sorts of action. So between putting a price on methane leaks and having naming and shaming from the invisible becoming visible, those are two really easy solutions that there isn't much of a legitimate argument against. So I think that's why they're catching traction. They make sense, they're real, they're consistent with market dynamics, and they empower people with information.
You're absolutely right. And we've seen how successful shareholders have been in holding companies into account and using their, exercising their voting rights in climate action. I want to move towards the financial markets, because one of the things that many of us have been talking about and warning for the past, I would say more than 10 years, it's about the carbon bubble and the impact that physical risks could have on financial stability. We were listening to the Brazilian Central Bank right before about how they already, feel it in Brazil. And we think that if we don't decarbonize fast and we don't build resilience, the financial crisis of 2008 would be a kid's game, right, compared of what could happen in the world. And let me tell you just very quickly 2 data points. The European Central Bank, has warned that escalating climate hazards could shave several percentage points of euro area GDP within this decade. And on the other hand, the European Insurance Supervisor shows that physical climate risks are now affecting all property-related insurance lines in Europe, driving up premiums and shrinking coverage and increasing threatening insurability itself. What are your thoughts on what's the state in the U.S.?
When I was the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, we had probably a dozen hearings on this topic, because not only are the warnings really abundant, and not from green groups either, from the Federal Reserve, from the International Financial Stability Board, from Freddie Mac, from Goldman Sachs, from a whole variety of groups that you don't think of as being climate friendly, but they're attuned to danger to financial markets, and they're warning about a 2008 style or worse economic collapse that cascades first into the insurance markets, and then when the insurance markets fail, that drags down mortgage markets, because you can't get a mortgage on an uninsurable home, and that cascades into property values, because if you can't find buyers because they can't get mortgages on your property, it has just lost a lot of value, and that cascades into a 2008 style crash. That is widely warned of. I call it the Great Climate Insurance Collapse, and it is not only on its way, it is also already happening in Florida. All you have to do is go to Florida and you see the early stages of this collapse. The carbon bubble is out there also. The carbon bubble is what happens when world markets understand that fossil fuel companies now are not viable any longer, and that fossil fuel is not viable any longer. And there's a sudden repricing of fossil fuel stocks. there's a sudden repricing of fossil fuel assets, and that shock from the sudden collapse of fossil fuel cascades out through the economy. Now, both of those things can happen at the same time, but I think you're absolutely right to be focusing on the clear fact that long before the natural systems upheaval destroys attributes of human life on planet Earth, very big, powerful interests like the insurance industry that have to look forward and predict will be taking action now based on what they see coming later. And that is why they're pulling out of insurance markets out west because of wildfire, pulling out of insurance markets along coast because of coastal flooding. So the insurance signal is the first powerful economic signal that this is not about polar bears and green jobs anymore.
You're absolutely right. And one sector that is very close to me, the pension fund sector, it's another of the sectors that is being hit, that has been really worried because they are starting to be extremely preoccupied about their ability to meet their fiduciary duties in the long term. And at the same time, what we realize, at least in Europe, is that the asset owners are not getting that access to policymakers. They're not lobbying as hard as other parts of the financial industry. You mentioned lobbying before, but wanted to say, just 2 days ago, we had a panel right here on corporate climate lobbying, and the outcome and all the ratings seem to be saying that actually companies are being much more transparent, that the practices are much better when it comes to lobbying and so forth. And yet, at the same time, we've never, ever, at least in Europe, we've seen this level of unprecedented lobbying and intimidation, on both sides of the Atlantic. So, how could it be? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have been in the Senate now for 18 years, and I live in an environment of political pressures and lobbying, and I can assure you that the corporate sector is nearly useless on climate advocacy. The fossil fuel sector is relentlessly, mercilessly active against climate action and has a whole array of influence machinery to do that. They must have 100 different front groups that they work through. It's like keys on a piano. They can play them in chords and crescendos as they wish, and many of us don't even notice that they're keys on the same piano. Plus, they have the ability to spend unlimited amounts of money now in American politics and hide that it's them when they do. So the corruption factor has exploded. So against all of that machinery, the counter pressure from the corporate sector is near zero. Worse, in the middle are the big corporate lobbying organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, which have been 100% co-opted by their fossil fuel donors, so that they're now willing to throw their insurance members, their banking members, the members that are, own hospital chains and are benevolently interested in climate change. They're willing to throw all of those people under the bus to serve the portion of their membership that is the fossil fuel industry. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been my constant enemy on all things climate for as long as I have been there, and from time to time by groups like InfluenceMap has been determined to be the worst anti-climate force in the United States of America. So the corporate sector collectively is the enemy of climate action, and it runs from virulently opposed to greenwashing as the range, with maybe an exception for Patagonia.
Senator Whitehouse, before you go, I know you have a very, very busy and tight schedule. One last question. How can science regain its authority in a world that is shaped by misinformation and polarization?
You know, we've basically been through 3 eras in the climate battle that we've had. The first era was the science era. And the scientists got it right. They really nailed it. I mean, God bless them. They were right. Even the Exxon scientists got it right. You go back and read their predictions from the 70s and the 80s, bang on. They nailed it. Then it became the era of politics, and it became the job of people in my line of work to listen to the scientists, hear their warnings, and adopt policies that would head off the dangers that the scientists had told us about. We failed catastrophically because of fossil fuel industry, malign influence, and pressure. So having failed, we're now at the beginning of era 3, which is the era of consequences. The stuff that the scientists predicted and that we failed to protect against is now coming true. So that gives a big opening for all of us to go back and relitigate what the scientists were telling us all along. And it's going to have a whole new resonance because it's not just hypothesis. It's not just prediction. It's now the explanation of why that bill from your insurance company doubled. It's the explanation of why that notice of non-renewal came through your door that told you you were fired by your insurance company and set you loose trying to have to figure out how the hell am I going to insure my home? Nobody wants to insure me. That is happening all across the country. In Texas, 92% of Texans in a poll that I saw got done are concerned about their homeowners insurance. It's more than health care. It's more than groceries. It's at the front of people's minds, and it connects to climate change. So we have the opportunity now to go back and say, okay, you didn't believe us last time. Here's the truth. This is why it's happening to you here, and it's a whole new audience for that truth.
Senator Whitehouse, I know you need to leave. Thank you so much for being with us today, and good luck in all your endeavors, yeah? And let's keep science, out there.
Science at the forefront and fight like hell.
Thank you very much.